Introduction. Should world events give these people a chance, they will destroy what has them by the throat as surely as the San Domingo blacks destroyed the French plantocracy. C.L.R. James. Section I. We are all indebted to the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company for reissuing C.L.R. James's important but little-known book, A History of Pan-African Revolt. Originally published in 1938 under the title A History of Negro Revolt, this brief but suggestive global history of black resistance appeared the same year as James's magnum opus, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution, and thus lived in its shadow ever since. Although it was brought back into print with a new epilogue by James in 1969, and again in 1985, by small activist publishing outlets, A History of Pan-African Revolt, as the later editions were titled, has remained one of the best-kept secrets among a handful of Marxists and black militants. It never sold many copies, but everyone familiar with James's ideas or the resurgence of Pan-Africanism in the 1960s knew of its influence. The late Walter Rodney, the great historian and Guyanese revolutionary, once called it a mine of ideas advancing far ahead of its time. Ahead of its time, indeed. 5 years before the publication of Herbert Tapp Thaker's American Negro Slave Revolts and just 3 years after the appearance of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, another book way ahead of its time, A History of Negro Revolt excoriated imperialism and placed black laborers at the center of world events when the leading historians of his day believed Africans were savages, colonialism was a civilizing mission, and slavery was a somewhat benevolent institution. James knew he was challenging established fictions. The only place where Negroes did not revolt, he wrote in 1939, is in the pages of capitalist historians. He had set out to tell the story of the so-called inarticulate masses in motion, of black workers and peasants fighting their European masters, of an ambivalent black petite bourgeoisie whose stand vis-à-vis capitalism and colonial domination was never certain. By broadly defining black workers as all who labor or whom colonial powers hope to turn into cheap-wage slaves or market-driven peasants, James casts his net widely and includes slave revolts, strikes, millenarian movements, and a vast array of anti-racist protests. As a study of Negro rebellions, A History of Negro Revolt completely revised African and diasporic history by focusing on the masses. Of course, there are leaders, but like Toussaint Louverture and San Domingo, leaders are made by the masses and the times in which they live. James makes a point of describing how the masses defend their leaders by freeing them from jail cells, hiding them in huts and cellars, pummeling their detractors into silence. It is the masses, and only the masses, that can make the utopian speeches of a Simon Kimbong, a John Chilimwe, a Marcus Garvey, or a Kwame Nkrumah reality. A History of Negro Revolt, however, was not simply an outgrowth of James's vision and brilliance. It was a collective endeavor, a product of specific political campaigns, debates and intellectual exchange with some of the leading black radical thinkers of the 20th century. It is not just another history book, it is a historical document in its own right, a testament to the streams of radical thought that converged in London's cafes, libraries, and underheated flats where young Africans and West Indians gathered during the 1930s, the decade when fascism and a depressed economy threw into question the fate of humanity. Section 2. Cyril Lionel Robert James was barely in his 30s when he began circulating among London's black radicals. And given his background, living the life of a Marxist intellectual with Pan-Africanist leanings was hardly what he or his parents had in mind. The son of a schoolteacher born in the small village of Tunapuna, Trinidad, in 1901, James was raised solidly middle class, at least in terms of cultural capital if not actual money. He read Thackeray and Shakespeare with enthusiasm, and due to his mother's influence he became an inveterate reader of history, literature, and to a lesser degree politics. He refused to stay within the boundaries of bourgeois culture, however. He adored carnival, calypso, and jazz, despite his Puritan mom's warnings, and he deeply loved the game of cricket. After earning a school certificate from Queen's Royal College in 1918, he decided to stay in Trinidad and become a schoolmaster. In his spare time he wrote and lectured on many topics, including calypso and cricket, and soon developed a reputation throughout the island as a brilliant young scholar with intelligent things to say about Caribbean popular culture. He was drawn to nationalist politics when Captain Arthur Cipriani, the celebrated Trinidadian labor leader of French Creole heritage, asked him to write articles on cricket and assorted cultural and political issues for the Socialist, the organ of the Trinidad Working Men's Association, TWA. James went on to write a pamphlet titled The Life of Captain Cipriani, an account of British government in the West Indies, which was published in Trinidad in 1932. An abridged version appeared a year later in England under the title The Case for West Indian Self-Government. While the pamphlet and his work with the Socialist represents an early stage in James's politicization, he was still a long way from the militant anti-imperialist he would eventually become. Never an activist for the TWA, James identified with the Labour Party and firmly believed in parliamentary politics. But England changed all that. In 1932, James left his homeland to assist Sir Leary Constantine, the great West Indian cricketer turned lawyer, write a book on cricket and English society. To make ends meet, James took a job as a cricket correspondent for the Manchester Guardian and settled down in Lancashire. It was in Lancashire that he began his rapid drift to the left. His discussions with local workers made him more critical of capitalism and compelled him to study the classics of Marxism, including the book that would have a profound impact on his conception of history, Leon Trotsky's 3-volume History of the Russian Revolution. After relocating to London, he found his way into the Trotskyist camp and soon emerged as one of its main spokespersons. Indeed, by 1937 he had published a major book titled World Revolution, 1917–1936, The Rise and Fall of the Communist International, which happened to be the first Trotskyist history of the Comintern ever published. Thus it was as a budding Trotskyist and supporter of the Independent Labour Party that James entered London's hotbed of black anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist politics. They came from different colonies and different ideological camps, but they all shared a patriotic love for the motherland and her wayward children. Some, like Egyptian Deuce Muhammad Ali, veteran Pan-Africanist and founder of the African Times and Orient Review, were longtime residents of London. Others, such as Sierra Leonean radical Ita Wallace Johnson, Kenya's future President Jomo Kenyatta, and the Guyanese-born T. Ras Makonnen, born George Thomas Nathaniel Griffith, were, like James, fairly recent newcomers. These young intellectuals did more than talk, they formed a variety of political organizations and associations in London and throughout Europe, including the West African Students' Association, the Ethiopian Progressive Association, and the League of Colored Peoples founded by Jamaican physician Harold Moody. One of the most important men among these circles turned out to be James's childhood friend Malcolm Nurse. Now known as George Padmore, he had become a leading figure in the international communist movement. He left Trinidad for the United States as a young man and joined the Communist Party almost as soon as he stepped off the boat in New York Harbor. A militant organizer while at Howard University in Washington, D.C., Padmore rose quickly within the communist ranks and was eventually sent to study in the Soviet Union. So popular was he that the citizens of Moscow elected him to the city council. As a student at the University of the Toilers of the East, he could have run into any number of African leaders who, like him, had been drawn to the communist camp. Among the more prominent students were Ita Wallace Johnson, Jomo Kenyatta, and South African communists Moses Kotane, Edwin Mofuta Sanyana, and Albert Nzula. The impressive gathering of black radicals in Moscow not only contributed to the development of a left-wing Pan-Africanism but probably shaped Padmore's vision of a black international working-class movement that could unite Africa and the diaspora in a coordinated effort to overthrow colonialism, racism, and ultimately capitalism. Thus, when he became secretary of the International Trade Union Council of Negro Workers, ITUCNW, and editor of its journal, Negro Worker, Padmore saw no conflict between his work on behalf of African liberation and the struggle for socialism. In Padmore's view, the ITUCNW, which he first directed from Hamburg until it was forced to move to Copenhagen and then Paris, was much more than the black arm of the Red International of Labor Unions, Pro-Intern. It was the vanguard in the struggle for worldwide black liberation. Unfortunately, Padmore's hopes for the ITUCNW were dashed almost as soon as it got off the ground. By the time Padmore became James's political ally in 1935, he no longer believed that the Communist International could play a progressive role in the African liberation movement. With the transition to the Popular Front, the Comintern made fascism its main priority and put anti-colonial movements on the back burner. In retrospect, perhaps Padmore should have seen it coming. But in 1930, he had good reason to believe in the Comintern's commitment, if not their sincerity, to the emancipation of Africans and people of African descent. As early as 1922, the Fourth Congress of the Comintern adopted a set of theses describing blacks as a nationality oppressed by worldwide imperialist exploitation. Because black workers' struggles were now thought to be inherently anti-imperialist, communists were obliged to view black nationalist and anti-colonial movements more sympathetically. Moreover, the theses recognized the success of the UNIA under Marcus Garvey, as well as the Pan-African Congresses led by W.E.B. Du Bois, and urged that immediate steps be taken by the Comintern to call a World Congress of African Leaders. The Comintern did more than appropriate the familiar idioms of Pan-Africanism. During the late 1920s and early 1930s it actively supported anti-colonial movements. In 1926, for example, leading members of the German Communist Party founded the League Against Colonial Oppression to combat pro-colonial sentiments emerging in Germany. After a successful international conference in Brussels in 1927, it became clear to those in attendance that the League marked an important step toward coordinating various struggles for national liberation in the colonies and semi-colonies, and it served as an intermediary between the Communist International and the anti-colonial movement. The conferees, among them Jomo Kenyatta and Jawaharlal Nehru, passed a general resolution that proclaimed, "Africa for the Africans, and their full freedom and equality with other races and the right to govern Africa." The Sixth World Congress of the Comintern in 1928 passed an even more explicit resolution asserting that African Americans in the U.S. South and Africans under white domination in South Africa constituted oppressed nations and thus possessed an inherent right of self-determination. For many black communists in Africa, the United States, and even the West Indies, the resolution on black self-determination indirectly confirmed what they had long believed: black people had their own unique revolutionary tradition. Black communists published dozens of articles documenting the autonomous traditions of radicalism among Africans and people of African descent. Aside from the purely Marxian analysis, wrote African-American communist Gilbert Lewis in the pages of The Negro Worker, the Negro's history is replete with many actual instances of uprising against his exploiters and oppressors. In 1930, Padmore set out to document that history in an important book titled The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers. In some ways it provided a model for James's A History of Negro Revolt and inspired other contemporary and historical studies on African workers. Published in 1931 by the Red International of Labor Unions, this 126-page book was written primarily for workers in the Western capitalist countries who failed to comprehend why anti-colonial movements are integral to proletarian emancipation. Although he touches on slavery and pays attention to black resistance, Life and Struggles is more descriptive than historical. His primary purpose is to indict imperialism by documenting the horrible conditions black workers throughout the world had to endure. In addition to eliciting sympathy for black workers, Padmore wanted to show that the profits generated from the exploitation of colonial labor allowed capitalists to bribe the reformist and social fascist trade union bureaucrats and thereby enable them to betray the struggles of workers. In the end, however, the role of enlightened white workers, the progressives who had not been bought off, was to educate backward black workers of the futility of racial chauvinism and persuade them to cast their lot with the worldwide proletariat. It was a position James would find untenable. Section 3. As C.L.R. James drifted deeper into the world of Trotskyism, preparing for the Fourth International and cursing Stalinism's betrayal of Lenin's vision, Padmore drifted out of the communist movement altogether. In 1935 they ended up in the same place, thanks to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Indeed, virtually every self-respecting black activist, irrespective of their national origins or ideological bent, joined the Ethiopian defense campaigns. Literally dozens of support organizations were formed throughout the world to raise money for relief and medical aid, and black men from the Caribbean, the United States, and Africa volunteered to fight in Emperor Haile Selassie's army. T. Ras Makonnen, a comrade of James and Padmore in the Ethiopian Solidarity Movement, recalls the impact the invasion had on the black world. Letters simply poured into our office from blacks on 3 continents asking where could they register. And the same was true of Africa. When the Italians entered Addis Ababa, it was reported that school children wept in the Gold Coast. The overwhelming response to the invasion should not be surprising, for Ethiopia was not just any African country. Also known as Abyssinia, it held considerable historical, religious, and cultural significance for black people the world over. Not only had the Ethiopians under Emperor Menelik II managed to retain their independence while the rest of Africa was being carved up by Europeans, but their land had developed a reputation as the cradle of civilization, having been among the first countries in the world to adopt Christianity. In the Black Christian world, Ethiopia has remained one of its principal icons and, in some ways, might be called an African Jerusalem. As historian William Scott explained, many African Americans believe that Ethiopia had been predestined by biblical prophecy to redeem the black race from white rule. Their point of reference, of course, was the biblical passage Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God, Psalm 68:31. The Garvey movement, whose official anthem was entitled Ethiopia, Thou Land of Our Fathers, made constant reference to this African nation in its songs, rituals, and symbols. For the Black left, however, sentimentality and racial pride clouded the issue at hand, imperialism. While race scholars praised Abyssinia for its ancient civilizations, its written language, its rulers' proud claim of direct lineage to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, Black leftists discussed a mountainous peasant region in the Horn of Africa, ruled by a dying monarchy that did not believe in land reform. As one of the few regions on Earth where slavery persisted well into the early 1930s, Ethiopia was hardly a land of milk and honey. Indeed, in the life and struggles of Negro toilers, Padmore characterized Abyssinia as a feudal oligarchy under a reactionary emperor and called for an internal revolution against the reactionary religious hierarchy and the feudal system. But before the revolution could take place, they first needed to kick Mussolini's troops out of there. In August of 1935, James formed the International African Friends of Ethiopia. With CLR as chairman, its active members included Padmore, Jomo Kenyatta, Ita Wallace Johnson, Amy Ashwood Garvey, ex-wife of Marcus Garvey, T. Ras McConan, and Albert Maryshaw, who had attended the 1921 Pan-African Congress in London. James was the IAF's most active propagandist, publishing several articles in the New Leader, weekly paper of the Independent Labour Party, and one very substantial piece in the Keys, the official organ of the League of Colored People. These articles reveal James groping to reconcile two political worlds, Pan-Africanism and socialism. On the one hand, he took the position that the imperialist countries used the defense of Ethiopia as a pretext for war. Yet, as a black man who probably felt a tinge of pride in Ethiopia's legacy, and whose admiration for Africa ran much deeper than anti-imperialism, he felt obligated to defend the place of his ancestors. In his personal struggle to bring these two traditions together, he volunteered for service in the Ethiopian military. My reasons for this were simple. International socialists in Britain fight British imperialism because obviously it is more convenient to do so than fight, for instance, German imperialism. But Italian capitalism is the same enemy, only a little further removed. My hope was to get into the army. It would have given me an opportunity to make contact not only with the masses of the Abyssinians and other Africans, but in the ranks with them I would have had the best possible opportunity of putting across the international socialist case. I believed also that I could have been useful in helping to organize anti-fascist propaganda among the Italian troops. I did not intend to spend the rest of my life in Abyssinia, but, all things considered, I thought, and still think, that 2 or 3 years there, given the fact that I am a Negro and am especially interested in the African Revolution, was well worth the attempt. James, like many others, never had a chance to go. Haile Selassie discouraged volunteers in hopes of securing support from Western democracies and the League of Nations, and as soon as Italy's occupation became an accomplished fact, he and the royal family fled to England. Soon after the Ethiopian crisis subsided, IAF members regrouped and formed the International African Service Bureau, IASB, with Padmore at the helm. James edited its monthly journal, International African Opinion, from July to October 1938, and fed vital information to political organizations and newspapers about the situation in Africa. The IASB set out to keep the issue of colonialism in the public mind, not an easy task given the specter of fascism and the inevitability of war in Europe. Nevertheless, Ethiopia was the turning point in James's thinking and writing. The events surrounding the invasion and the failure of Western democracies to come to Ethiopia's defense pushed James beyond European Marxism toward a deeper understanding of the traditions of the black resistance. In a review of George Padmore's book, How Britain Rules Africa, James lambasted his comrade for suggesting that enlightened sections of the ruling class could play a progressive role in the liberation of Africa from colonial domination. Africans must win their own freedom, he insisted. Nobody will win it for them. James had come to the conclusion that the European working class movement could not win without the African masses, nor the latter without the former, and that only the African masses, workers, peasants, and perhaps some far-sighted intellectuals, fighting on their own terms could destroy imperialism. It was precisely this understanding that produced the Black Jacobins and A History of Negro Revolt, both published in 1938. These books were not written to appeal to white workers or a sympathetic liberal bourgeoisie. Rather, as Cedric Robinson so aptly put it, they were declarations of war. Section 4. A History of Negro Revolt first appeared in September of 1938, just 1 month before James sailed for the United States. Commissioned by Raymond Postgate, a comrade of his in the Independent Labor Party, the 97-page monograph was part of the fact series published by the party. This is what James had to say about it: such a book had never been done before. I gathered a lot of material in it, and really I'm astonished now at how much there was that I didn't know. But the book has the virtue that there were all sorts of problems, like the struggles of women, market women in Africa and so on, that went into it, aside from the historical things like the Haitian Revolution and the blacks in the American Civil War. The book has a peculiar history. Postgate's name got the book sold in bookstores all over the country. When they found out what was in it, some of them carefully hid it. There were places we went to where we found they had hidden it. They put it under a lot of other books, but when you asked for it, they would say, "Yes, we have it." The book was hidden for good reason. Like The Negro Worker, the HNW organ which Padmore edited in the early 1930s, it was profoundly subversive. It was a stinging indictment of colonialism, and James took no prisoners, not even his beloved France. Attacking France was not an easy thing to do, especially with fascism on the rise in Europe. The French not only let black colonials become deputies, governors, and cabinet ministers, but at the time James was writing, Prime Minister Léon Blum had become a sort of hero on the left. As the socialist head of the French Popular Front government, Blum actively sought to neutralize fascist attempts to overthrow the Spanish Republic. In the long run, none of this mattered to James. As he put it, imperialism remains imperialism. He French have as black a record in Africa as any other imperialist nation. And he proceeded to document that record and the efforts to resist. Just as he had tried to do as editor of International African Opinion, James wanted to make sure that colonialism would not be subordinated to the struggle against fascism, which is why he makes a point of saying that Africans under Italian fascism were no worse off than an African in the Congo under democratic Belgium, or a Rhodesian copper miner. The point is clear: there is no kinder, gentler colonialism. What made this book even more subversive is the fact that James places black people at the center of world events. He characterizes uprisings of savages and religious fanatics as revolutionary movements, and he insists that the great Western revolutionaries of the modern world needed the Africans as much as the Africans needed them. The latter point is central to the entire book and is made forcefully in the first chapter on the Haitian Revolution, the world's only successful slave revolt, according to James. Without the French Revolution, he asserts, its success would have been impossible. He is not simply talking about strategic support from revolutionary France, especially since the nature of the alliance between the Metropole and San Domingo's black rebels shifted with each regime. Rather, the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity transformed segments of the rank and file and the leadership, notably Toussaint Louverture. They embraced the revolutionary doctrine, they thought in republican terms. The result was that these slaves, lacking education, half-savage, and degraded in their slavery as only centuries of slavery can degrade, achieved a liberality in social aspiration and an elevation of political thought equivalent to anything similar that took place in France. Yet, while a burning desire for liberty, articulated in the aims of the French Revolution, drove the slave production relations on the plantation organized him. Here he echoes his classic line from the Black Jacobins. By working and living together in gangs of hundreds on the huge sugar factories which covered the North Plain, they were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at that time, and the rising was, therefore, a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. But no matter how proletarianized the slaves were, they could not do it alone. In his discussion of the United States, James shows how a rich history of slave uprisings, in his words, they revolted continuously, resulted in little more than heroic martyrs and a more repressive atmosphere. Victory was possible, however, when the conditions resembled that of Haiti, during the Revolutionary era when poor whites joined slaves, free blacks and mulattoes under the banner of liberty. But because the United States was not a small Caribbean island, the slaves and free blacks were always outnumbered and dispersed. More significantly, slavery was much too important to capitalist development to abolish it on principle. Here we see possibly the beginnings of James's influence on young Eric Williams, a former student of his back in Trinidad. Anticipating Williams's classic study, Slavery and Capitalism, James writes, "Slavery made cotton king. Cotton became the very life food of British industries, it built up New England factories." Furthermore, the growing impulse toward abolition was not that sudden change in the conscience of mankind so beloved of romantic and reactionary historians, but the climax of a gradual transformation of world economy. The U.S. Civil War was the moment of truth, the world event that gave these enslaved and half-starved black folk a chance. James's analysis of the slaves' actions during the conflict is taken straight from W.E.B. Du Bois's monumental Black Reconstruction in America, from his invocation of the general strike to his description of the slaves' hesitant responses toward the Union soldiers. Land was key. Indeed, it was the struggle for land that rendered this newly created peasantry a revolutionary force, for who understands better than the uprooted that land reform was a necessary first step toward emancipation. It was so in France in 1789 and in Russia in 1917, James argues. Peasants today are politically alert as never before. It was yet another challenge to Western Marxism, a tradition that had consistently distrusted the peasantry and invested all of its faith in the proletariat. Insisting that the peasantry, in this case ex-slaves, could be a revolutionary force in and of itself was not entirely new. Indian communist M. N. Roy had made a similar point in his 1920 debate with Lenin over the national colonial question. What is unique is James's claim that revolutionary mass movements take forms that are often cultural and religious rather than explicitly political. He forces the reader to re-examine these seemingly odd movements with new eyes, to take the beliefs and superstitions of Africans and African descendants seriously. Perhaps he came to this conclusion independently, for his first and only novel, Minty Alley, and his 1936 play about Toussaint Louverture, demonstrate an amazing sensitivity to the power of religion and culture as major social and political forces in black life. Or perhaps he was moved, as many people were, when he reached page 124 of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and found his brilliant defense of the power of the divine. Foolish talk, all of this, you say, of course, and that is because no American now believes in his religion. Its facts are mere symbolism, its revelation vague generalities, its ethics a matter of carefully balanced gain. But to most of the 4 million black folk emancipated by Civil War, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy of religious frenzy, or in the black stillness of the night. Whatever the source, A History of Negro Revolt reveals James's incredible faith in the masses and the supernatural forces that moved them. The Watchtower movement, for example, a millenarian movement that believed all Western governments were evil and had to be replaced by a more just order, is described here as one of the most powerful revolutionary forces in Africa during the 1930s. Whereas most Marxist interpreters thought such notions absurd and tended to dismiss religion as a diversion from the real struggle, James insisted that the ideas behind the Watchtower movement represent political realities and express political aspirations far more closely than programs and policies of parties with millions of members, numerous journals and half a century of history behind them. He also discusses religious uprisings in Eastern and Central Africa, most notably those led by John Cholimwe in Nyasaland and Simon Kimbung's cult in the Belgian Congo. If Marxists thought these black Christian radicals were insignificant or less important than, say, striking miners, the colonial state certainly did not. Even the smallest challenge from these sects was met with immense repression and violence. At the very least, James anticipated a later generation of historians who viewed these religious-based movements as the source for some of the most violent anti-colonial contests of the 20th century. James's biggest leap of faith is his discussion of Garveyism. By taking Marcus Garvey and his followers seriously, James diverged sharply from Padmore and most of his comrades in the IASB. In fact, Padmore, who, along with other IASP activists, used to heckle Garvey when he spoke at Hyde Park, had once written that Garveyism was the most reactionary expression of Negro bourgeois nationalism and therefore completely alien to the interests of the Negro toilers. Although James criticizes Garvey for his limited racial outlook, his collaboration with imperialists and American racists, notably the Ku Klux Klan, and his inability to see the virtues of industrial organization, he nonetheless acknowledges that Garvey had built the largest black mass movement in history. So rather than dismiss Garvey as a charlatan, James tries to understand his appeal. He had no other choice. Throughout A History of Negro Revolt, James hammers home the point that the masses have the capacity to move on their own, to throw up their own leaders, to understand the situation at hand. If Garvey had merely duped his followers, then a good proportion of the black world were dupes. The success of Garveyism, James suggests, has a lot to do with the peculiar and complex nature of racism. While many of his radical contemporaries focused in on the political, economic, and structural aspects of racism, James's chapter on Garvey explores its cultural and psychological dimensions. Instead of emphasizing how racism is used to divide the working class, he concentrates on how it is lived and experienced, how the Negro is made to feel his color at every turn. In a world where the very humanity of dark-skinned people was perpetually assaulted and questioned, Garvey gave his followers a sense of history and personhood. By linking the entire black world to Africa and to each other, he turned a national minority into an international majority. In James's words, he made the American Negro conscious of his African origin and created for the first time a feeling of international solidarity among Africans and people of African descent. James's recognition of the revolutionary potential of black nationalism should have made A History of Negro Revolt an instant classic among the left. By the late 1930s, virtually all left-wing movements were floundering on the Negro question, including the communists who had abandoned self-determination in favor of the Popular Front. In 1939, a year after James left England for the United States, he tried to persuade Leon Trotsky himself at a summit meeting in Coyoacán, Mexico, that the left needs to support autonomous black movements on their own terms, and that the struggle against racism and for democratic rights is primary to the struggle for socialism. Black nationalism, he insisted, was not some diversion from the class struggle but a revolutionary force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, James was about 3 decades too early, or the left was 3 decades too late. In the meantime, A History of Negro Revolt remained hidden just as James remembered. And to the many Marxists who still believed that the proletarian revolution would take the form of an industrial workers' uprising with themselves in the vanguard, the book made no sense. It was not until a new generation of Afro-coiffed young militants discovered this little book that its full import would be recognized. Section B. When Drum and Spear Press, a black nationalist-oriented publishing house in Washington, D.C., decided to inaugurate their company by reissuing A History of Negro Revolt in 1969, James had just been allowed to re-enter the United States the year before. He had been deported to England in 1953. The press was an outgrowth of the Drum and Spear Bookstore, a black activist-oriented outlet founded in 1967 by about a half-dozen former Southern civil rights organizers who had moved back to Washington. In addition to running the bookstore, they established a community school called the Center for Black Education. Frustrated by the dearth of books by or about black people, the Drum and Spear Collective decided to publish their own books and bring important works back into print. By this time, members of the collective had grown fairly close to CLR, who had moved to Washington a year after Drum and Spear Bookstore was founded. They had come to know James through Federal City College, some of them having been fellow faculty members there. His 16th Street apartment soon became a kind of meeting ground for these young intellectuals to discuss black liberation, community organizing, history, sociology, politics, and a whole host of issues. Indeed, James not only participated in discussions leading to the founding of Drum and Spear Press, but it was he who volunteered A History of Negro Revolt as its first title. The Drum and Spear Collective was happy to oblige, for they clearly respected James as an elder mentor for their generation. In the introduction to the new edition, Marvin Holloway of the Center for Black Education characterized James as a living revolutionary who had seen and experienced struggles that most young militants only read about. At a time when black people throughout the world are clamoring for self-knowledge, The 68-year-old CLR has become a great source of wisdom and counsel to youth in the resistance movement, 7 and 8. And what better time to be a source of wisdom and counsel? The year he returned to the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, the ghettos were in flames, the Black Panther Party was making front-page news, militant college students were demonstrating for black studies departments, and Republican Richard Nixon was elected president on the promise of crushing the wave of dissent that threatened to destroy American civilization. James himself had just concluded a lecture tour in East and West Africa, so he was returning with first-hand knowledge of the situation in the newly independent African states. Along with the new title, A History of Pan-African Revolt, James added a 43-page epilogue titled A History. By about 1973 the store and the press literally faded out of existence, in part due to the effect the riots had on black businesses on 14th Street, and in part due to the usual difficulties that arise with activist-oriented enterprises. Their business decisions were driven by political motives rather than profit motives. Of Pan-African Revolt, a summary 1939 to 1969, which briefly explores decolonization in Africa, the civil rights movement in the United States, and recent conflicts in the Caribbean. The epilogue is important, for it reflects James's intellectual and political development since the book first appeared 3 decades earlier as a fact monograph of the British Independent Labour Party. He does not simply attach more episodes of Black rebellion to the story, he adds substantively to the conceptual framework he developed in the first edition. First, the epilogue gives us an even stronger defense of black nationalism than the earlier chapters had. Of course, by the 1960s black nationalism itself had become more forceful and radical, adopting a rhetoric and style far more militant than anything Marcus Garvey had imagined. Some black nationalists in the United States talked of armed struggle, expressed solidarity with other anti-colonial movements, learned African languages, and, most importantly, identified with the ghetto poor. But James's growing appreciation for the revolutionary potential of black nationalism can be traced back much further, at least to the Second World War. As a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and regular contributor to its newspaper, The Militant, James was deeply impressed with the rise of black self-organization and activism during the war. African American trade union membership rose from 150, in 1935 to 1 million by 1945. Civil rights organizations recruited tens of thousands of new members. The NAACP, for example, had grown tenfold during the war, and mainstream black leaders insisted on a double victory against racism at home and fascism abroad. The Double V campaign, embodied powerfully in A. Philip Randolph's threatened March on Washington in 1943, partly articulated the sense of hope and anger that a lot of black people shared. As black journalist R.O.I. Otley observed during the early years of the war, one could not walk the streets of Harlem and not notice a profound change. Listen to the way Negroes are talking these days. Black men have become noisy, aggressive, and sometimes defiant. By the war's end, James was convinced of the necessity of black nationalism as an essential element of the black freedom struggle. As early as 1945, he believed that the Negro is nationalist to his heart and is perfectly right to be so. His racism, his nationalism, are a necessary means of giving him strength, self-respect and organization in order to fight for integration into American society. 2 years later, in an important document titled The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the U.S.A., he echoed these sentiments and pushed even further. By virtue of their experiences in the United States under racism and capitalism, he argued, black people were inherently revolutionary. Anyone who knows them, he concluded, who knows their history, is able to talk to them intimately, watches them in their own theaters, watches them at their dances, watches them in their churches, reads their press with a discerning eye, must recognize that although their social force may not be able to compare with the social force of a corresponding number of organized workers, the hatred of bourgeois society and the readiness to destroy it when the opportunity should present itself, rests among them to a degree greater than in any other section of the population in the United States. Thus the rise of black power did not surprise James at all. What surprised his old left-wing supporters, however, was how little he spoke about the proletariat during this period. Although he defensively reminded his critics that he was still a man of the proletariat, the epilogue, like many of his speeches in the late 1960s, says less about working-class struggles than the previous chapters. Instead, The dominant forces in the post-1938 Black Revolution are students, civil rights activists, intellectuals. This shift in emphasis is a product of the time and the context. James was quite taken with the Black Power movement, especially the more left-leaning spokespersons like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown. In a 1967 speech, for example, he dismissed charges that Carmichael was a racialist and suggested that his vision was much closer to socialism than the white left realized. Citing Lenin to prove his point, he argued vehemently that the Black Power movement constitutes a challenge to capital and therefore should be backed by the left. Moreover, he reminded his audience of the importance of supporting black self-organization, irrespective of contradictions the movement might exhibit. Who are we to say yes, you are entitled to say this but not to say that, you are entitled to do this but not to do that. If we know the realities of Negro oppression in the USA, and if you don't, we should keep our mouths shut until we do. Then we should guide ourselves by a West Indian expression which I recommend to you: what he do, he well do. Let me repeat that: what the American Negroes do is, as far as we are concerned, well done. They will take their chances, they will risk their liberty, they will risk their lives if need be. The decisions are theirs. Where Black Power counted most, however, was in Africa. Clearly the linchpin of the Pan-African Revolt was the continent itself, and the struggle that had the greatest impact on James took place in the Gold Coast, the British West African colony that became modern Ghana in 1957. The Gold Coast Revolution and its esteemed leader, Kwame Nkrumah, is the centerpiece of the epilogue. He believed, as did many of his peers, that Ghana would be the beacon lighting the way toward the emancipation of Black Africa. James had met Nkrumah years before while he was a student at Lincoln University, a historically black institution in Pennsylvania. With Padmore practically training Nkrumah to lead the independence struggle in his homeland, James had a tremendous amount of confidence in this young man. But it was his visit to Ghana in 1957 that really opened his eyes to the political importance of this small West African country. So moved by the events he witnessed in Accra, James quickly postponed plans for a pamphlet on Hungary and immediately set out to write a small book on Ghana. The level of militancy and self-organization he observed challenged earlier theories of revolution, including some of the ideas put forth in his own Black Jacobins. Now he questioned the extent to which revolutions in Western Europe and African revolutions were interdependent. While James worried that Ghana, like other newly independent nations, had the potential of being overtaken by bureaucratic corruption, he was nonetheless convinced that something different was happening under Nkrumah, true grassroots democracy. By making Ghana the center of a continent-wide African liberation movement, James surmised, Nkrumah would keep the revolution permanent. And by moving immediately to socialism through state intervention and initiating new social relations from below, Ghana could make the revolutionary transition that neither the USSR nor Eastern Europe was capable of making. By the mid-1960s, however, his enthusiasm for Nkrumah and Ghana had diminished. He admitted that the new society he had hoped for was not built, and that Nkrumah allowed bureaucratic corruption to take over. Ghana's failure provided James with two critical lessons for constructing post-colonial society, both of which carried over into A History of Pan-African Revolt. First, a revolutionary society cannot be created unless the colonial state is completely dismantled. Second, the new generation of African leaders need to create and sustain democratic institutions throughout the country. Even if those institutions are critical of the government, a new society cannot be built without them. These 2 points bear the obvious imprint of Frantz Fanon, whose book The Wretched of the Earth James had read before writing the epilogue. While James understood the importance of dismantling the colonial state in theory, he knew in practice that the African leaders of the newly independent nations tended to be Western-educated civil servants who were products of the colonial state and thus had a personal stake in maintaining it. What was needed to rid Africa of its bureaucratic petite bourgeoisie was uncompromising revolt, permanent revolution from below. The political and cultural resources for such a revolution, he argues, can be found in traditional African society. Once again, James displays his enormous faith in the forms of organization and culture created by the masses themselves. But unlike the earlier chapters, the epilogue looks to these forms not just as sources of resistance to imperialism but as the basis for a new society. There are also the democratic instincts and practices of the African tribes, he observed in 1957, Not those damn chiefs with their feathers and umbrellas and stools, made into petty tyrants by the British government, but the old tribal method of appointing them by election and throwing them out if they were unsatisfactory. Here he makes his sharpest break yet from the European Marxist tradition. Socialism, he concluded, need not be built on the logic of modern industrial organization, it can be built on pre-capitalist traditions of democracy and communal social relations. James obviously came to this conclusion independently, but so did several African nationalists, including Senegal's Leopold Senghor and Tanzania's Julius Nyerere. When Ghana failed to live up to its promises, James decided that Tanzania was now Africa's hope for the future. Indeed, he ends this book as well as his study of Nkrumah with a paean to Nyerere's approach to socialist transformation titled Always Out of Africa. In hindsight, of course, we know that Nyerere's attempt to establish a collectively run national economy based on communal villages was an utter disaster, that his regime repressed strikes and opposition movements, and that his party, the Tanzanian African National Union, TANU, had more than its share of corruption. But when James wrote the epilogue, TANU's famous Arusha Declaration laying out the philosophy and structure of Tanzania's African Socialist Society was less than 2 years old. And, on paper, it was an incredibly progressive document. With bylaws requiring party and government leaders to be either a peasant or a worker, and should in no way be associated with the practices of capitalism or feudalism, how could any socialist not be impressed? What attracted James more than anything was Nyerere's ideas for public education. Nyerere planned to establish schools that would prepare students to create a socialist society based on traditional culture. James believed these were the key grassroots institutions that could sustain democracy and ultimately destroy the colonial state. The book closes on a hopeful note. Nyerere had not only found a revolutionary path for Africa but made the most important contribution to Marxist thought since Lenin. As we now know, James was wrong on the first count, and depending on who you talk to, some might say he was wrong on both counts. The idea that Africans ought to draw on their own resources and cultures in order to build a socialist society is hard to contest. The problem lies in the belief that pre-colonial African societies were inherently democratic and practiced a form of primitive communism that could lay the groundwork for modern socialism. Several historians have challenged this romantic view of Africa's past, exposing the level of class and gender exploitation internal to so-called traditional societies. That James accepted this view does not diminish in any way James's brilliance or the profound insights this book has to offer. Rather, it simply means that he is no fortune teller. Yet, what I find quite puzzling is his complete silence on Tanzania throughout the remainder of his life. Even after sharp criticisms of the Tanda government were leveled by radical intellectuals within Tanzania, James apparently never responded or corrected his earlier assessments, at least not in print. Indeed, he included his unaltered assessment of Nyerere and Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, which appeared in 1977, 1 year after Issa Shivji, a Tanzanian Marxist historian, thoroughly excised the utter bankruptcy of Nyerere's policies in his highly acclaimed book, Class Struggles in Tanzania. After Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution was published, however, the 76-year-old radical could no longer maintain the Herculean pace that made him one of the most prolific activists in the Western world. His relative silence on Africa, as with many other issues, should not come as a surprise. Section VI. A History of Pan-African Revolt is one of those rare books that continues to strike a chord of urgency, even half a century after it was first published. Time and time again, its lessons have proven to be valuable and relevant for understanding liberation movements in Africa and the diaspora. Each generation who has had the opportunity to read this small book finds new insights, new lessons, new visions for their own age. When the Race Today Collective, a gathering of people of color in London who edited the progressive multicultural magazine of the same title, decided to bring back into print A History of Negro Revolt in 1985, they found the book as meaningful to their world as it was to the African and Caribbean radicals who had walked the same streets 50 years earlier. Although Ethiopia was not the pressing issue this time around, many of the battles they fought would have been familiar to the 1930s generation: South Africa, Grenada, the riots in Brixton, racist violence against immigrants, the struggle for black political empowerment. We publish this third edition at a moment when the course of Negro revolt enters a period of increased acceleration. The masses of Caribbean peoples are in open revolt against American imperialism. Such is the intensity of the movement that it takes the might of the American military to contain it. South Africa is stirring and the end of the apartheid regime cannot be long delayed. The emergence of Jesse Jackson, as a major figure in American politics, can only be explained by the mass movement from below of American blacks. We are certain that a history of Negro revolt contributes to an understanding of these events and will inform action in a way in which few historical documents have. In reading and rereading this classic text, we ought to reflect on our own times and determine how this book might inform our own actions. What can this book tell us about post-apartheid South Africa under President Nelson Mandela? The desperate situation in James's beloved Haiti? Ethnic cleansing in Rwanda? What of heightened racism and anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States? The incredibly high rates of unemployment and violence in Western capitalist cities and the left's virtual abandonment of America's black ghettos? No piece of literature can substitute for a crystal ball, and only religious fundamentalists believe that a book can provide comprehensive answers to all questions. But if nothing else, A History of Pan-African Revolt leaves us with two incontrovertible facts. First, as long as black people are denied freedom, humanity, and a decent standard of living, they will continue to revolt. Second, unless these revolts involve the ordinary masses and take place on their own terms, they have no hope of succeeding. As James once said of the revolution in Ghana, their struggles may appear sometimes pathetic, sometimes vastly comic, ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous, but always vibrant with the life that only a mass of ordinary people can give. And if world events are on their side, they just might win.